what makes an outboard unreliable. The lack of maintenance, the old rusty components, the lack of grease and oil on things, the salt buildup on the starter, on the alternator, corroded connections, old battery cables that have been, had really tight bends in them. Things like that are what's going to cause you a problem and make it unreliable. So, like, take the battery cables, for instance, or your main harness that's feeding the engine. You want those harnesses because it is a wire and it's stranded. You don't want to have sharp bends in it. It's not like a solid copper wire where you can make a 90-degree bend and not have a problem. If you take a wire like that on a boat and you kink it, so let's say you've got an extra 5 feet of wire. Most people want to just leave that wire. You need to loop it up in a circle so that way it has a nice bend to it and it's not, creating a restriction point for the electrical current to run through that wire. But if you got a wire and it's bent like this and then zip tied like that, and then it's just got this straight, sharp bend in it, well, over time, that stranded wire, which is what's used on the wires on a boat, is going to fail one strand at a time. And over 10, 15 years of running and bouncing around and taking the beating of being in the water, that is a failure point on that wire. And eventually it's going to cause you problems and it's going to fail. So looking for those kinds of things is going to help you to alleviate something that's going to be unreliable. And in order to make the engine more reliable, you just have to service all those items, servicing regularly at the proper intervals, doing your oil changes, gear loop changes, fuel filters regularly, checking your, connection points at the batteries, at your power posts in the back. If you've got junction transfer lugs in the back, also looking at things like, oiling these things, putting CRC on the engine, corrosion protection, changing the anodes, greasing, oiling all those components, like the shift shaft that goes down to the lower unit. A lot of them has a grease fitting, or if it doesn't have a grease fitting, can you get in there and spray some WD-40 or some other kind of oil that will help keep that lubed up, some kind of a penetrating oil or a corrosive, protection oil to help keep that component from drying out and rusting up and then, building up salt on it. One of the biggest problems that you're going to have with an outboard is when you let it sit. If it doesn't get used for 6 years, that's potentially a problem. It's also an opportunity for a deal if you can find one that was flushed, fogged, put away, and properly oiled and lubed up, and then it got put away. Well, that engine sitting with all that oil and everything on it, it's going to be, you get it out, put oil into the cylinders before you try and crank it, try and lube up everything, empty out the fuel system and get new fuel, good fuel to the engine. Then, that's probably a really good engine to get, even though it's been sitting, as long as you do those prep things before you just go and try use it. And then everything's oiled up and now you start using it, you might be able to find yourself a deal that way. But if that engine has been sitting for 6, 7 years and nothing's been moving, that's what makes it unreliable. So if you've got an outboard and, you put it away for season, say you're up north and you winterize your engine and then put it away, as long as everything's lubed up, whenever you get it out, you're going to be fine. But if you don't and you just let it sit there, it could be a problem. Or if you're in a climate where, your boating season is 7, 8 months long, what you can do is if you don't get to run your boat regularly, at least try and start the engine and run it every couple weeks. Let water flow through it, let it heat up, check the oils, move the throttle, shift it, steer it back and forth. So that way, all those components, as long as you're moving them and they stay lubed, greased, and oiled, it's going to work that grease, going to work that oil into those pivot points and those places where it has movement. That's going to keep them from freezing up, drying up, and causing you some unreliability problems later on. Now, if you enjoyed this clip, you can watch the full episode over here, or you can watch another one over here.